preached parts of the sermon that I'm going to share with you this morning right about 3 years ago. It was my first sermon here when you were thinking about hiring me. And a lot of people said, well, that was a bit of a strange sermon. And I said, well, it probably told you everything you needed to know about me. But you guys hired me, so checkmate on that one there. The original opening, I said something like this. I said, we're entering a Christmas season. This was before Christmas. And it was a time of global loss. We had just witnessed Afghanistan fall back to the Taliban. We had seen 5.3 million Syrian refugees crossing borders. We'd seen the global refugee crisis grow to 82 million people in total that year. 2.2 million of those were Afghan refugees. Those statistics sound like they could be from today's news. When we think back on what a year this has been, there's an ongoing global conflict with just various layers of nuance and proxies and all kinds of things going on. There's military and humanitarian crisis on either side of the border with Israel and Gaza. It swept the region into a larger war. Iran fired 300 ballistic missiles. I never thought I'd see that in my lifetime. There's turf disputes in the South China Sea. We saw the fall of the Syrian government within the past month. It's anybody's guess as to how many of these situations will play out. As we come out of a holiday season, which is culturally about decorations and food and presents, it can feel very out of touch with what's really happening in the world. And sometimes our own faith can follow this, where we make the season all about a cute little baby born in a manger, and it feels very out of touch with what's really happening. And I would argue it's out of touch with what was happening back in the first century, and we're going to see that in today's text. But you don't have to be in the holiday season to feel this kind of dissonance. You might feel this any particular Sunday. Have you ever been in a place in your spiritual walk where you're not feeling it? Right? Maybe there's some tragedy, some trauma that's happening in your life, and you show up at church, and it's like the Jesus cheer squad in here. And you just feel that sense of dissonance of they are all happy with Jesus, and I kind of rolled in here and I'm in survival mode. I've been there. It's not fun. Sunday is the hardest day of the week when you're feeling like God is the one crushing you and everyone else is super excited about that. How can both of these things be true? How can we celebrate Jesus while we experience deep loss? Are we fake? Are we a hypocrite if we do something like this? Maybe we should just lean into the pain and keep our distance from this Jesus cheer squad. If you will, take your Bibles and turn to Matthew chapter 2. This is the third sermon in the series going through the book of Matthew. Now there's 4 scenes in Matthew chapter 2 that we're going to go through today, and these are going to bring this dissonance into sharp focus of how can we experience our greatest tragedies in our life and yet still celebrate the coming King. The whole birth narrative from Christmas Eve service all the way into here, this is actually kind of one whole unit, and it is so hard for me to break a unit into its parts because you miss the whole, and so I've already done that since we covered part of it on Christmas Eve service, but there's 5 Old Testament quotes that Matthew is using. The first one we talked about on Christmas Eve. We're going to talk about the next 4 today. In my application, I'm going to bring in the one from last week, and we're just going to see them kind of work together. But the first thing we're going to see in this text today is that there's a cosmic blunder. Starting in verse 1, it says, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, 'Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him.' When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, 'In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet. And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means the least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel.' Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, 'Go and search diligently for the child, and when you found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him.' After listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then opening their treasures, they offered him gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. This chapter opens up with this word Bethlehem, which is where Jesus was born. It says now after, starts with that phrase, now after. A lot of times in our nativity scenes, we see, the three wise men. I agree with what Steve said, that we don't know there's three, they're not kings. There's a lot in the tradition that just gets kind of put into popular language and we just accept. But one of those things is that they're right there in the birth scene and they're not. This is probably about 2 years later, 2 years after Jesus' birth. And so really they don't belong in the scene at all. They come a bit later. But Jesus is born in Bethlehem. Now, Bethlehem has a fascinating name. It literally means house of bread. So you think, okay, well, Jesus is the bread of life. The bread of life is born in the house of bread. This place has significance. It's where the famine started, which is the whole kind of the backdrop for the book of Ruth, also in the line of Christ. So you have a famine of bread in the house of bread in Bethlehem. This is also where Isaac's favorite wife, Rachel, is buried. It's about 5 miles away from Jerusalem. So Jesus is born here in the house of bread. This is a city that is so poor and so insignificant that outside of the scripture, there's not another kind of pop culture, ancient pop culture reference to it anywhere else that people have found. It's not a notable place. It's right next to a notable place. Jerusalem is all over the place. But Bethlehem itself is kind of just this poor little neighborhood. It's hard to have a more human and lowly birth than being born in a borrowed room in a poor town. Matthew introduces a character. Now, as we go through the book of Matthew, there are going to be quite a few Herods. Herod had quite a few offspring, and many of them are named Herod, so it can get confusing. This one is Herod the Great. He is half Edomite, and he's half Jewish. So the Edomites came from the line of Esau. That was Jacob's brother. And because he was sort of half and half, he was not well loved by his neighbors, and he also did not love his neighbors well. He hated the Jews, but he did everything he could to try to placate them. Because he needed to keep the peace, because Rome is watching him. So he's kind of Rome's vassal. Rome is the empire. They've installed him as the local king, and it's his job or his problem if things get out of control. So he observed certain things, like he would observe the dietary restrictions. He would not eat pork. But that's kind of where a lot of his Jewishness ended. He was known for being quite the murderous person. He killed one of his wives and 3 of his sons. He killed his brother-in-law, his mother-in-law, and his wife's grandfather. In the spirit of Christmas, 2 turtle doves and a partridge and a pear tree. I mean, if this guy suspected you of being a threat at all, he killed you. He ordered the killing of his top advisors at the time of his death. And he said it this way, there's not going to be crying because of my death, but there will be crying at my death. Wisely, they didn't follow through on that command. The Emperor Caesar Augustus knew this about him, and he said, it's better to be his pig than his son. There's a little play on words there, but the emperor is basically saying, look, because he's kind of sort of Jewish and won't eat pigs, at least if you're a pig in his house, you're safe. So here we have Herod, King Herod the Great. He's the next character that's brought in, and these wise men, they come into the scene. Now, we're not 100% sure who these wise men are. Some people call them magi. The text calls them magi. Some people think they were Arab. This is based on the gifts that they were bringing, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Well, frankincense in particular, myrrh also, comes specifically from the Arabian Peninsula, and so they think, well, that's why they're from there. But if you're a wealthy person, this kind of thing is traded, and you could buy this probably anywhere, so that's not a slam dunk. Others think they were potentially Babylonian and Persian because of the term magi. We know in the book of Daniel that he is interacting with the other wise men in that book, and they are magi, so that's a likely case. Whatever the case, though, we know that this is actually prophesied about in the Old Testament. In Isaiah 60, verse 6, Isaiah says, a multitude of camels shall cover you, the young camels of Midian and Ephah. All of those camels from Sheba shall come. They shall bring gold and frankincense. They shall bring good news, the praises of the Lord. All the flocks of Kedar shall be gathered to you. The rams of Nebaioth shall minister to you. They shall come up with acceptance on my altar, and I will beautify my house. Isaiah is saying that there are going to be these people groups. Most of these people groups are in Arabia and the Middle East, and they're going to bring these gifts, and they're going to offer them to the Messiah. Jesus came for lowly Jewish shepherds, but he also came for rich Arab or Persian astrologers. He came for Jews and Gentiles, the rich and the poor. Thus far in Matthew, we've seen people who are Moabite, Hittite, Ammonite, Canaanite, and now with the introduction of Herod and the wise men, we have Edomites and either Persians or Arabs, depending on which case you care to make. Matthew has a global focus in his gospel that Jesus is for everyone. But they ask this question to King Herod. They said, where is he who is born king of the Jews? This phrase, born king, we focus on the birth of, well, there was a baby that was born. And sometimes because we're not as concerned about this being in a democracy where we elect our presidents, we don't really care who is, quote, the rightful heir to something. It's not a question that keeps us up at night. But if you are a self-imposed or an outside-imposed ruler over a people, you care very much who is the rightful heir to the throne, particularly when people start using the language of, there's someone who is born king. Who is that person? Born king of the Jews. This is the kind of thing that could turn a kingdom on its head. The wise men are called wise men, but there's kind of this sense where they're not super wise in certain regards. They came in and they asked a despotic murderer, where is his successor being born? If they had read the local newspaper, they would know you don't talk about Herod's successor anywhere within earshot of him. It's a terrifying place to be, where your own existence as king hangs in the balance between the empire that allows you to exist and a people who kind of wish that you were dead. And so here he hears the news that there's this king born. They said, we saw his star. There's a lot of wild theories on this star, some of them credible, some of them pretty incredible. Johann Kepler calculated it in 7 BC that Jupiter and Saturn aligned with the constellation Pisces. A gentleman came out with a movie called The Star of Bethlehem, and he argues that twice in 6 BC the moon comes in front of Jupiter, making Jupiter appear and disappear and reappear. In both of these cases, 6 BC is a little bit too early for any of this to really be happening. Kepler also thought that perhaps a supernova, an exploding star, followed by the convergence of the whole Saturn-Jupiter-Pisces thing, could possibly be the answer. Some have suggested maybe it was Halley's Comet, but Halley's Comet would have passed by in 12 BC. So there's a lot of theories out there. I would say don't hang your faith on what is or isn't the star. Matthew tells us there's a star. There could be a number of explanations. It could just be a miraculous event. It doesn't have to be something that necessarily that we can predict. All we know is that the wise men show up. The fascinating thing is, I don't believe the event is made up. One, because I take the Bible at its word, but two, here's why. Astrology is not really spoken well of throughout the Bible. Read the Old Testament. Start Steve's reading plan, great idea. You're going to go through the Old Testament where it talks about all the occultic practices that they're to have nothing to do with. If Matthew is writing a New Testament gospel to believers that he's trying not to associate with pagan idolatry, witchcraft, etc., why on earth would you include a story of these occultic leaders coming in unless it happened? Right? And so I don't need to understand the science of, is it a comet? Is it a nova? Is it a miraculous event? I don't think Matthew would have included it in his gospel unless it actually happened, just because of how frowned upon astrology is in the Jewish community. But this news, this announcement that there are these visitors who have come, probably with quite a large entourage. Nobody travels alone at that time. Probably with a large entourage. They come in, they come to the king, and they say, where is he who's born king of the Jews? And it says that Herod is troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Herod should have rejoiced if he were truly believing, if he could truly lean into that side of him which was Jewish and who knew the promises of the coming Messiah, who knew that the coming Messiah would mean peace on earth, he would have celebrated. And yet he didn't. He was troubled. He was shaken. The word has this much deeper meaning. It's not just, well, he was a little bit moved or he was considering these things. It has a sense of being terrified or like a house being shaken. His insecurities, which so often end in violence, are about to again raise their ugly head in this passage. He brings in the chief priests and scribes, and he says, he's inquiring of them. Matthew says, where the Christ was to be born. That term Christ, I've talked about this before, it's not Jesus' last name. This is the Greek term for Messiah. He calls in the religious leaders. He says, where is the anointed one going to be born? So here we have Herod going from receiving this news to immediately his mind is connecting some dots going, oh, this could be a Messiah. In the introductory to the series, I talked about the growing messianic hope of all of the terrible things that were happening during the ending of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New, and how there were these revolutionary movements happening out in the hill country, out in the wilderness, and they were gaining popularity. And every time one of them would kind of rise up, you'd sort of see people hold their breath and go, is this the Messiah? Is this when it happens? And so here we see him holding his breath for a very different reason. He does not want to lose power. Also, the news of a Messiah being born could spread like wildfire. The last thing he wants is another rebellion on his hands. So he brings in the chief priests. These guys, they're educated, they're trained in the law, and yet they are equally dumb. Maybe they felt a sense of validation. I don't know. You know, the king of the country calls you in and he's looking for your advice. You know, you kind of pop your suspenders and go, excuse me, boys, I have to step out of our meeting. The king is calling me. I don't know. But all I know is the information they gave him was absolutely dumb. He says, where's this baby? Who's the successor? Where's the Messiah going to be born? And they pull out their Old Testament text and they read, this is the second quote from the Old Testament out of the 5. He says, but you, O Bethlehem, Micah 5:2. Who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth from me one who is to be ruler of Israel, whose coming forth is of old, from ancient days. They told Herod where to find the baby, knowing that this guy is a murderer. Here we see, though, a few elements of the identity of the Messiah being confirmed out of the Old Testament. Number one, he is of old. How is it possible for a new baby who's being born, for his origins to be of old? From ancient days, as predicted by Micah. Well, John 1 tells us this. It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and he was in the beginning with God. That is how it is. Matthew is presenting so many elements of who is Jesus, but he's not doing systematic theology where he's trying to put it into a nicely formed creed or statement for us. He's just sharing the information as he has it, and he leaves it to us to put it all together. But they added an extra line in here, or Matthew added the extra line in here. He shall be a shepherd from his people is not actually part of the Micah quote. It's from 2 Samuel 5:2. And this is spoken over King David. It says, in times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led us out and brought in Israel. And the Lord said to you, you shall be a shepherd of my people, and you shall be a prince over Israel. That idea of shepherding, this was something applied to King David. The promise of Micah and the promise of David are fulfilled in this same person. They're fulfilled in Jesus. This title, shepherd, this gets applied to the leaders of Israel throughout various stages of their history. Often, though, not in a complimentary way, in a kind of you're failing way. Ezekiel 34, you can read the whole chapter. It's all about the, quote, shepherds of Israel. I'll read just a couple verses from Ezekiel 34, 1-3. It says, the word of the Lord came to me, son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, even to the shepherds, thus says the Lord God. Ah, shepherds of Israel, who have been feeding yourselves. Should not shepherds feed the sheep? You eat the fat, you clothe yourselves with wool, you slaughter the fat ones, but you do not feed the sheep. Matthew is combining this passage from 2 Samuel and the one from Micah, which is speaking of David. David was not the good shepherd either. He was called to be a shepherd over his people, but he also failed. He's announced as the shepherd, but he's never the perfect shepherd, and that's because he points us towards Jesus. In verses 7 and 8, we see Herod's cruel intentions come forward. Go and search diligently for the child. When you found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him. Craig Blomberg says, despite their pagan background and powerful influence in Babylon or Persian courts, the Magi recognize and worship the Christ child for who he is. Despite his role as ruler of Israel and his professed conversion to Judaism, Herod rejects the newborn king and plots to destroy him. So he's contrasting those two. He fears this young boy will threaten his royal position and authority. So we learn already at this early stage of life of Jesus that the allegiances he will create will extend far beyond the boundaries of Judaism, while at the same time threaten and alienate many within those boundaries. This is what is happening right here in the text in front of us. Herod is rejecting Jesus while the wise men are seeking him. They go and they pay homage to him. Our translations say worship, but worship doesn't mean worship like we think of worship as affirming the truth of who he is, per se. They're simply paying him respect as a new king. There are three gifts that are brought, beginning with one of the early church theologians. His name was Origen, all the way to modern times. A lot of people see a connection or a symbolism with the gifts, the gold being a kingly gift. The frankincense is incense, something you would burn inside of a temple. They see this as a kind of divine recognition that he is God. And myrrh represents, passion or the burial. It was an embalming kind of spice. I would say probably the Magi didn't understand the theological significance of this. As modern readers, we certainly do, but I don't think they thought this through, and this is a statement of theology from them. I think these are just very common gifts that you would give to royalty. They all represent very, very expensive gifts, very hard to find gifts. And so because of this, they were gifts fit for a new king. It's possible they gave more than three gifts. We don't know. It's just three referenced. This is probably why people think there were three kings, three gifts, three kings. Could be, one king and have three gifts. We sometimes assume too much. Matthew at least focuses on these three gifts, and it's quite possible that Matthew would have the symbolism in mind. All of this happens, and immediately from here, there's a need for a change. This is when Matthew changes scenes to the flight to Egypt, starting in verse 13. It says, now when they had departed, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, rise and take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt, and he remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt I have called my son. This is to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt I've called my son. This is almost a word-for-word quote from Hosea 11:1. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. That's what Hosea says. Now, if you read Hosea, and if you've ever taken a How to Interpret the Bible course, and you're trying to figure out how is Matthew interpreting the Bible, this is the one where you're going to kind of scratch your head and go, it seems like he's just yanking this one out of context. And that's because he's yanking this one out of context. This is not at all really a messianic prophecy per se. A lot of times people are trying to figure out what sort of method he was using. There were different sects of Judaism that interpreted the Bible, the Old Testament scriptures, in various ways, and they're trying to figure out, is he in this school, is he in this school? You're going to see Matthew's interpretation of the Old Testament be all over the place. But one theologian suggests that perhaps the best way of understanding how Matthew is using this is he's trying to pull out how in the Old Testament the Messiah himself was associated with this idea of sonship. This is not a New Testament concept at all, I think is what Matthew is getting at. So if we just have the sonship of the Messiah before we have Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God, it kind of helps us understand that second phrase later. A few verses in the Old Testament, Psalm 2:7, it says, I will tell of the decrees the Lord said to me, you are my son, today I have begotten you. Psalm 89:26-27, he shall cry to me, you are my Father, my God, and the rock of my salvation. I will make him the firstborn, the highest of the kings of earth. 2 Samuel 7:14, I will be a father to him, and he shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rods of men, with the stripes of the sons of men. And so we don't have to understand Matthew's hermeneutical strategy. If we just look at the whole Old Testament and go, are many of the references towards the Messiah about his sonship with God? The answer is yes, very clearly so. This is a very common Old Testament theme. So Joseph gets a dream, and they rise, and they go to Egypt. The text would make it sound like very, very quickly after that, Herod comes in, and we see the weeping mother. Verse 16 says, "Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious. He sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Then he fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more." The theme of exile runs throughout the first couple of chapters of Matthew. If you remember Sermon 1 on the genealogy, Matthew gives us 3 sets of names, 3 sets of 14 names, from Abraham to David, and then from David to the exile, and then from exile to Christ. And so the way that he arranges those, he's kind of setting up Jesus coming in at the tail end of the exile. Luke does it the exact opposite way. He starts with Jesus and then goes all the way back. And so the way that Matthew is doing this, he's kind of highlighting the exile in what he's saying. Then you start taking all of the verses that he's pulling from Isaiah and all of these other quotes that I've used today. These are all from this same period of the exile. Jesus is reenacting their suffering in the way that Matthew is telling this. Matthew adds a layer of nuance here because he's echoing back to another time, not just the exile, but also the Exodus. During the book of Exodus, Pharaoh had all of the Hebrew children, the Hebrew boys, killed. And so there's all of these points of their greatest tragedy, their greatest traumas, their greatest fears, their greatest times of weakness. Matthew's just bringing all of these to the surface right through here. Jesus is identifying. We looked at the list of names of all the various kinds of sinners, men and women, in the genealogy. And now we're looking through all the various kinds of trauma and tragedy that the people of Israel as a nation have experienced. And Jesus is right there with us. We often ask this question when bad things are happening: where is God right now? Where is God? How could God leave me to this? Well, the answer is he's right there with us. Jesus knows what it's like to flee from his home because someone's trying to kill him. Jesus knows what it's like to be in exile. He knows what it's like to be rescued out of exile. The naive introductions by the wise men initiate a sequence of treacherous events. Joseph gets this dream, and Jesus becomes an international migrant in the face of just impending doom. Herod has all the boys in the region killed that were 2 years old and under. It is catastrophic, but sometimes in kind of like children's storybook Bibles or renditions of this in cartoons, I mean, it sounds like it's a widespread massacre, and it's probably, if you think of the size of Jerusalem, how many boys, how many babies, how many children of that age, we're probably looking at anywhere from 12 to 20, which is a great tragedy if that's your baby. But in the broad scheme of things, of all of the bad things that were happening in Israel, this probably wouldn't have made, the evening news outside of Bethlehem. Why is this story in here? Why is Matthew dragging us through the Exodus and dragging us through the exile to just tell us who Jesus is? Well, one is to fulfill prophecy. That prophecy that I just read in verse 19. This goes all the way back to Rachel. He's talking about Rachel weeping for her children. So there's 3 points that we're going to look at. One is the point that we're currently in Matthew. There's the question of Jeremiah, the quote that he's pulling from. And then even that one is referencing something further back, all the way back to Genesis. So when we go back to Genesis, Rachel, she's about to have her final son. It's her final son because as she's giving childbirth, it says it was a difficult and painful childbirth, and she is dying. And in her dying breath, she's right outside of, you guessed it, Bethlehem, which is where her tomb is. And her dying moments, she gets news that she has been given a son, one final son. This is good news to her. And while she is weeping and crying, she is also comforted with the fact that a son is born. Jeremiah pulls this language in. Here's what Jeremiah says in chapter 31:15. He says, "Thus says the Lord, a voice is heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping. Rachel is weeping for her children. She refuses to be comforted for her children because they are no more. Thus says the Lord, keep your voice from weeping and your eyes from tears, for there is a reward for your work, declares the Lord. They shall come back from the land of the enemy. There is hope for your future, declares the Lord, and your children shall come back to their own country." Jeremiah, part of his role in the exile was where he was stationed. He actually oversaw, not like responsible for, but he witnessed the deportation of all of the Jews. They were staged up right there in Ramah, which is in the same vicinity as Bethlehem. So there's all these layers overlaid in this one spot. Rachel's death, all of the deportation of the Jews, and now the killing of the innocents right here in Matthew. And very poetically he says this is like Rachel weeping over her children. She's used as the symbolic mother. But he's quoting from Jeremiah 31. And Jeremiah 31 is not all gloom and doom. Verse 3 of Jeremiah 31 starts with a reminder of God's steadfast love. He says, "I have loved you with an everlasting love. Therefore, I have continued my faithfulness to you." Verse 9 is a promise of return. "I will make them walk by the brooks of water in a straight path in which they shall not stumble, for I am the father to Israel, and Ephraim is my firstborn." He promises to change joy for gladness in verse 13. "I will turn their mourning into joy. I will comfort them and give them gladness for sorrow." He promises satisfaction in verse 14. "My people shall be satisfied with goodness, declares the Lord." Verse 21, he promises that they're going to remember the way home. "Set up road markers for yourself. Make yourself guideposts. Consider well the highway, the road by which you went. Return, O Virgin Israel, return to these your cities." And then in verse 31, there's the announcement of the new covenant. "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. My covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, declares the Lord, I will put my law within them. I will write it on their hearts. I will be their God. They will be my people. No longer shall each one teach his neighbor and each his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they shall all know me, for the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more." Rachel is weeping over the slaughter of the innocents in Jeremiah, over the deportation in Genesis, over her own life being lost. But in each of those phases, Jesus is the fulfillment. He is the messianic hope. In each of those moments of despair, they're looking forward to the Messiah who's going to come and fix this. Another reason why Matthew might have included this is to identify with human suffering. Imagine reading this story after 70 AD when the temple was destroyed and probably half of your family was killed or enslaved and you're on the run from the Roman government trying to kill you. You're reading a story where you go, wait a second, Jesus was on the run. I can't say, where is God? God knows what it's like to be on the run. His own son was on the run, fleeing for his life. You wonder if refugees read this opening chapter with a little bit more interest than we do. Matthew might have also been making the point that Jesus is the new Moses. This is something he likes to do throughout the book of Matthew. In Exodus 1, we see the killing of the babies. But I'd say one of the big reasons is that he's hearkening to Israel's most dangerous stories, the slavery in Egypt and the exile, and their primary stories of God's deliverance. Yes, their time as slaves in Egypt, it was terrible, but they had the Exodus, this time of God's power being poured out in a military kind of way, a very visible way, conquering their enemies, bringing them out, giving them a land. We see the exile where yes, terrible time where they were taken captive out of their home, but then also a similar thing where God brought them back into the land with power. Now think for a moment, how might people in Jesus' home neighborhood receive him when he comes back? Think of the whispers. the locals haven't forgotten. I don't imagine the news of that is super widespread. There's lots of killing that's been going on. But imagine just the town specifically that remembers there was that one family that got out just in time, right before all of our kids were killed. Mark, in chapter 6, he talks about Jesus being rejected in his hometown. And Jesus even says a prophet is not appreciated in his hometown. This chapter closes with a return, an exodus from their exile, if you will. Verse 19 says, "But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, 'Rise and take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead.' And he rose and he took the child and his mother, and he went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. And he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, so that what is spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene." Archelaus was one of Herod's sons who took over in his after his death, and he was not one of the stable sons, believe it or not. And so you'll often see Jesus' ministry skirting around the areas where Archelaus has rule over. Archelaus was never made king. He was just kind of set up as like a district leader, and so we see Jesus oftentimes swinging wide of that area. We see Joseph doing it right here. The interesting thing, though, about Jesus being called a Nazarene, use your Bible search tool. There's no Old Testament passage that Matthew's referencing, none whatsoever. None of the prophets ever said he should be called a Nazarene. So, like if you're going to be a critic of the Bible, is this the point where you go, aha, see, we've got it? Well, not so fast. If you look at the whole Old Testament, you go, okay, there's a large body of texts that talk about how the Messiah will be despised, how he will be shamed, how he will be rejected. They're all over the place. I mean, there's dozens and dozens and dozens of these references. Now, we don't catch the potential slur that's happening here, but there's kind of a slur that's going on. If you thought Bethlehem was a backwoods place, Nazareth is even more cut off than that. It's kind of between two major places. It's out in the middle of nowhere. It would be kind of how we might, in a pejorative way, call someone a redneck or a hillbilly here. And so I think what Matthew is doing is he's not citing a particular Old Testament prophet which says this, because none of them do. I think what he's doing is he's saying, look, the sentiment in the Old Testament is the Messiah is going to be this person of dispersion, this person that people don't like. And I think he's making it contemporary based on where they chose to live. He went to the bad neighborhood, y'all. He's one of them, just like the prophet said. So he's not quoting directly. I think he's just summarizing and then kind of making it contemporary for them. There's also another potential thing, which is the word for branch. So Isaiah 11:1, if you're wondering why there's stumps everywhere, we started our Christmas Eve service with Isaiah 11:1, which is talking about the stump of Jesse. There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. The word for branch in Hebrew is very, very similar. It's Nezer. Nezer is Nazareth. Nezer, you hear just like an S and a Z, very close linguistically speaking. So it's possible that he's making a word play back to Isaiah 11:1 of Jesus is this Nazarene. He's this branch that's coming out of Jesse. I like that. I don't have to die on that hill, but I like that. What does this mean for us? Now, I'm going to take the five Old Testament passages that he quotes. I'm going to pull the one from last week, which was, behold, a virgin will conceive and bear a son, and you'll call his name Emmanuel. And I want to use those in our application this morning and kind of turn them into promises, if you will. So promise one is from Isaiah. It's the sign of the virgin. This sign was originally given to Ahaz, and it was a sign of doom. The virgin will bear a son. And that's how you know the end is coming, because before the child is old enough to eat solid foods, all of your worst fears are going to be realized. It's a sign of doom. But when he gives this same verse to Joseph, it's the sign of hope of, this is the one you've been longing for all along, God with us. Are you needing a sign this morning? This is the sign. Follow Jesus. Promise number 2, this comes from the Micah and Samuel, that a scepter will rise, and that the scepter rising out of Bethlehem is going to be a shepherd for the people. Israel had been abused and harassed and misled from within and from without. And while the present power base in Jerusalem was corrupted, it was held by usurpers from an unlikely source and an almost nameless place. The true king is born. It's not Herod, cruel and murderous. He's like a shepherd who cares for his sheep. He fulfills what's lacking in the shepherd King David and in the other shepherds that Israel had, because he is the good shepherd. Jesus is not here to crush and subjugate us. He is here to rescue us. We might think in today's world we need a military leader, we need a strong leader, we need a leader that's crazier than all of the other world's leaders, so they'll just sit down and be quiet and stop the nonsense. But God's power isn't coming from expected human sources. It comes from babies and from shepherds and from Nazarenes. Are you needing a shepherd? Are you needing someone to lead and guide and protect you? Follow Jesus. Promise number 3 is from Jeremiah, that there will be a new covenant and that you will be forgiven. The weight of the old covenant was wearisome. Who can keep all of the rules? Even in the issuance of the new covenant, he says, look, it's not going to be like the old covenant. And there's this bracket statement, the one that I gave them when I picked them up and carried them out of Egypt, and then they just broke it. He references that it was impossible to keep. Even if you could keep the old covenant, it doesn't make up for past sins that you've already committed. What do you do with those? This is an impossible weight that we all bear. It's frustrating. But Jesus brings in the new covenant, one that's written on our hearts. The promise of he will be our God, will be his people. He will take our sin away because he is the one sent to bear our sin. Are you needing to be forgiven? Are you needing your past rewritten? Follow Jesus. Promise number 4 from Hosea. Israel strayed again and again. In the book of Hosea, he compares them to an unfaithful wife. He tells Hosea to marry a prostitute, essentially, and to be faithful to her, even though she's not ordered to quit her day job. And he says, this is my relationship with my people. I am faithful to you, and you're a prostitute. Any self-respecting husband would have divorced and put away such a wife, but God did not cast them aside. Jesus' love for his people is not based on our worthiness to be loved, our likability, the fact that we can make ourselves worthy of it. It's based on his ability to show his steadfast and unconditional love. Are you needing love this morning? Are you needing a home? Follow Jesus. Promise number 5 from the various prophets. The branch of Jesse is here. He is going to be despised by some and loved by others. The world seeks power and prestige. It demands success from its leaders. We create what's called a cult of personality where we uphold these leaders, and these leaders represent our deepest aspirations. They're our heroes, and we worship them for it. Jesus is no such leader. Even though he is God with us, he is not of noble birth. He's not born in prominence. Rather, he's born in obscurity. He's despised. He's rejected. He's poor. He's an immigrant. Jesus is going to be accepted nonetheless by people beyond the borders of Israel, beyond his people, beyond the ones he came for. And within those circles, he's going to be divisive. There's a bit of a warning with this final promise. God is cutting down trees of power. He's leveling them to stumps, his own people included. The stump of Jesse is where the branch of Jesus comes out of. Jesse was also a stump. And yet, the only branch that's going to grow out of these stumps is his own. Don't miss it. Follow Jesus. Let's pray. God, I pray that in our times of need and tragedy, that we would think back to this. These stories are not just given to add historical weight, to add a degree of technicality to reading what should be an easy story. These stories are given for hope. If you were the answer in the time of the Exodus, and if you're the answer in the time of the exile, you're the answer for today. But just like your people have rejected you, so many today also reject you. And yet you have come for all, for the rich, the poor, for the insider, the outsider, for your people, for not your people. We talk about following you for our salvation, but we need to follow you every day. Give us the faith to reject all of our cultural solutions as the solution. Help us to look to you. Our problems, from your perspective, are quite simple. Follow you. You make it easy for us. You are the shepherd who guides us and protects us. Lord, I pray if there are those who have not accepted you as their shepherd, as their guide this morning, that you would be calling them to do so. I ask this in your name.